Hey, this is Scott, and today we're going to go over the IQ, and I'll give my final thoughts on the Tamron 70-210mm f4 lens. My first impression of this lens was that it was a little soft compared to the Canon 70-200 2.8 Mark II, and that may be true in some cases, but keep in mind that that lens is double in price. The Tamron 2.8 G2 lens is as sharp as the Canon and closer in price to the f4, but when looking back at my photos, a majority of them had very little noticeable difference in sharpness, and the 70-210 f4 lens was very pleasing for me at least. Overall though, the sharpness doesn't really seem to drop off much except in the extreme corners, and there's not a whole lot to be gained by stopping down, which means that you can comfortably use this lens wide open at f4. The results were a bit sharper on the wider end and in the middle of the range than they were at 210mm, but there's not a huge difference there. When looking at real world shots, the sharpness was more than enough for me though. The bottom line is that it resolves all the details you could want fairly well, such as eyelashes. Simply put, there's practically no chromatic aberration. That's all there is to it. The vignette is fairly light on the wide end, and it gets darker as you zoom in closer to 210mm. On the wide end, any vignette clears up pretty quickly, but on the longer end, you'll need to stop down a couple of stops to get rid of it. I actually didn't get a chance to specifically include tests for flare because of weather and time constraints, but it never showed up in any of my shots even with bright lights shining into the lens at the Yoskoi festival. There's really not much distortion here either. While there may be a very slight amount at either end of the zoom range, it's really nothing to be concerned about. Bokeh is of course subjective, but I feel like this lens had a pleasing autofocus area. In real shots, it never felt distracting, and looking at more clearly defined bokeh balls, they don't seem to have much in the way of onion rings or distracting edges. They lose their perfect roundness when stopping down of course, but they still remain relatively nicely shaped. In terms of autofocus accuracy and consistency, I had no problems here. I calibrated the lens using the FocalCal software, and the results were very consistent. My real-world use definitely proved to be the same. When testing the autofocus speed side by side with the Canon 2.8 Mark II, the Canon clearly outperformed the Tamron, but again, this is a fairly unbalanced comparison. As a side note, the 2.8 G2 lens from Tamron falls somewhere in the middle, and from my very limited experience with Canon's newer f4 lens, that was on the faster end of the range. With high-speed action, I did feel like the Tamron f4 had a little bit of a hard time keeping up in some cases, a series of shots of the subject coming straight towards the camera for example, but generally it didn't cause me any trouble unless you're really racking focus from one extreme to the other and you need that quick response. Tamron claims about 4 stops of vibration compensation here, and I did find that to be true, actually getting more than half of my shots in focus up to about 4.6 stops lower than the recommended shutter speed at 70mm. It was a bit harder out at 210mm, but I still managed to get around half of my shots in focus at Tamron's claimed 4 stops below what you typically aim for. This obviously was far from a scientific test, but as everyone's hand steadiness and handling is different, I think that these results give no reason to doubt Tamron's claim. So overall, for a weather-sealed lens in the 70-200mm range, at this price I was very pleased with this lens. It does have its shortcomings of course, for example the autofocus speed compared to some of the more expensive lenses, as well as maybe the VC performance in terms of how it stabilizes the viewfinder, but honestly I really don't think that many people who are looking at a lens for this price, trying to find the absolute cheapest option available, are really going to be affected too much by those things. For once, I think that my recommendations on a lens in this 70-200mm category is very clear-cut. If you want the best possible price and still a solid performance with things like weather sealing and a constant aperture, this is definitely the one to choose. If If you want to save up a little bit more money, you basically have two choices that I would recommend, and those are the new Canon f4 Mark II lens and the Tamron 70-200 f2.8 G2 lens. Between those two, I would recommend the Canon only if you want something that is smaller and lighter, or if you want something that is, a native Canon lens, but if you're watching this video, I suspect that you're already open to the idea of using a Tamron lens anyway. In this mid-level price range, if you're not worried about size and weight, then I would definitely recommend the G2 2.8 lens from Tamron. Its performance was pretty much on par with the Canon f2.8L Mark II lens, which is an amazing lens. Its image quality was great, build quality, it has a few different modes of VC, and there's really no downside to it besides the fact that it's not a native Canon lens, and it hasn't been, time tested like that Canon lens has either. It's only been out for a year or a couple years at this point, so still, I would definitely recommend that if you're choosing between these two lenses at this price range. If you want to pay pretty much double what you're going to be paying for this Tamron f4 lens, then you could go for, of course, the Canon f2.8 Mark II lens, which I have and I love, and it's a time-tested lens. It's been used by thousands of people in a number of different situations. It's been beaten and just kept on kicking. It's a proven lens that is amazing. I don't think there's really anybody that could say anything bad about that lens, and they did just announce a Mark III version, which I think is good for basically two things. One is bringing down the price of the Mark II lens, and the other is the fact that you might see a little bit of a rise in the number of used Mark II lenses on the market. Even so, if you do want to save money, like I said, this Tamron 70-210 is definitely a great choice. Just be aware of those little compromises you'll have to make compared to some of the more expensive competition. But again, those are things that I really don't think will bother most of the people who are looking to save money on a lens like this. And the fact that it's smaller and lighter definitely might mean for a lot of people that you'll bring it along with you more often than a larger and heavier lens. And if you don't bring the lens with you, it doesn't matter how good it is, it doesn't do you any good. So having a lens that you're more likely to bring with you might be a very, very big value and a very big plus in terms of this 70-210 f4 lens. So if you have any questions or comments, be sure to let me know down below. If you like this video or found it helpful, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to see more in the future. Check out the other videos in the series if you want to see more information. And as always, thank you for watching.